everyone. Welcome to Writer of the Week. Today we're here with Diane C. McPhail, author of The Abolitionist Daughter. Diane began her career and built her reputation as an artist and gallery director. Life led her to become a therapist, working with a large metropolitan hospital in outpatient mental health. When she moved to the mountains, her curiosity and compassion led her to complete a doctorate in ministry focused on creativity and spirituality. She resumed the writing she had begun in college, initially just for herself. As the writing progressed, enriched by her experience, Diane pursued studies in multiple workshops, conferences, and coursework, including the University of Iowa Distance Learning and the Yale Writers Workshop. In addition to her MFA, MA, and doctorate in ministry, Diane is an active member of North Carolina Writers Network and the Historical Novel Society. She's a recent presenter at various literary events, regional and national. She lives in Highlands, North Carolina with her husband Ray and her dog Pepper. Welcome, Diane. How are you?
I'm wonderful, Melissa. Thank you. I appreciate this invitation so much. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So we're going to start off with you reading an excerpt from your book. Can you tell us what it's about?
This is just sort of setting the scene in the late 1850s. It's a social scene that introduces some of the characters, my protagonist, Emily, and her brothers. At the edge of the swirling dancers, Emily buried her hands deep in the pockets of her green gown, her fingers worrying at some dry seeds she had picked up somewhere along the way. Around her, the dancers circled, clapped, changed partners, tapped their feet as the fiddler wove his spell. Emily did not dance, though she wanted to, longed to even, and found her toes tapping under her hoops whenever there was music. As a young girl, occupied with grief of her motherless upbringing, she had deemed herself clumsy. Her father tried to teach her the steps, but she never found them natural. Too much counting and concentration on left and right. Nor was Emily at ease in conversation, except in her family. Even there, she often kept her thoughts to herself. Social events were a self-conscious agony to her. However, her widowed father insisted on attending, hoping somehow that social exposure would make up the deficit. Now Emily lifted her gaze to the gangly fellow who pranced through the line of dancers with one of the Sutton girls on his arm. Here was her younger brother, Jeremiah, all mouth and legs, same as on his horse or in the field and even at his studies, prone to blurting out whatever came to mind. He moved incessantly, prone even in sleep to toss and jerk, perhaps juggling his mother's death like an endlessly burning coal. Emily turned away from the current of dancers, seeking refuge by the door ajar in the cool night air. At the door, Emily's elder brother, Will, was speaking intently with Michael Lambert, who smiled and nodded to her. She knew Mr. Lambert as a quiet, kind man, one of a pair of old bachelor brothers, working their homestead together. Emily returned the nod, but hesitated, unwilling either to be drawn into conversation or to turn back toward the undertow of dancers.
So you grew up in Mississippi and your parents were from Greensboro, where your book is set. It takes place from the late 1850s to the late 1860s. What is your connection to that time period and what made you want to examine it in more depth?
Well, actually, Greensboro is now considered, it's called a ghost town. It doesn't exist anymore. My parents' families were from the county where Greensboro had been. And I grew up with this story of a kind of horrific violence that I was haunted by, but never connected to other than just this was a story from that part of the country and from that time and era. As I began to get older, the story somehow stayed with me. And I realized that through a series of circumstances that indeed this story was deeply connected to me. And it was for that reason that it's almost as if the story chose me rather than that I chose it.
And you wrote this book to unveil a family secret that you happened to stumble over. Can you tell us more about that and whether it was healing to uncover and write about it?
Yes, indeed. And those are the circumstances that I was mentioning. Because my mother died soon after I was born, I never knew much about her. I knew that she could draw and that she could sew, but very little else. So in my middle adulthood, I felt this deep yearning to know who my mother had been. And almost everyone was gone who would have known her, except this one uncle who lived in the old home place. And I went to visit him, and he was telling me these charming stories about their childhood and showing me old albums of photography. And I turned the page, and there was this old newspaper article about bloody Greensboro and this horrific incident. And I laid the album down and I said, you know, I've never quite understood how these women who endured this, how they survived this kind of trauma and this kind of grief. And my uncle sat back and he said, Diane, do you know who this young woman was? And of course I said, well, no, she's just the woman in this story. He said, that was our grandmother. That was your mother's and my grandmother. So then, most books, you read the blurbs and it's, oh, this secret is revealed in the story. For me, the story came about because this secret was revealed.
And can you elaborate on your interest in the emotional survival of your protagonist, Emily, and her mother-in-law, and if that's related to being a therapist?
Absolutely. As I said, the story had haunted me with how these women in this newspaper article, how they survived this kind of trauma. Because as a therapist, I dealt with trauma on a regular basis, and it has horrendous effects on people. And we know now about PTSD and how very difficult it can be to overcome. So from the standpoint of a therapist, I was amazed at how these women and they as a kind of microcosm of the Civil War that was they were surrounded with, how all of these women specifically to this story, and a whole nation of women who were surviving trauma through this war, how did they go forward? How did they manage? How did they live forward? Because they clearly did.
And I know you did extensive research in a number of directions. Were there any aspects of that research that came as a surprise to you, perhaps even changing the story?
Yes, indeed. I had no idea in this story that the judge, who is the abolitionist and was my great-great-grandfather, I had no idea that he had made valiant attempts to free his slaves. I had no idea that he was anti-slavery. I had no idea that freeing your slaves was illegal. After about 1853, manumission, which is freeing your slaves, was illegal as part of all of those compromises between slave and free states. That was one of those conditions that came up and was agreed upon. Prior to that, you could free your slaves if you wanted to. You could free them in your will. They could buy their freedom, but there was simply no avenue to freedom after 1853. So this was all a great surprise to me. And I was just I was overcome with gratitude to have this kind of ancestry and to know more about all of these people who were working against, they were working to do what was absolutely right when what was right had been made illegal.
That's incredible. What do you think it was about the judge that gave him that strength of character?
I think he was a good man. And I think there were more good men in the South than the stereotypes give us credit for.
And you've indicated one important piece of research that seems especially timely. Can you talk about that?
Yes, this was a total surprise. I was in conversation with Jane Smiley, who won the Pulitzer for 1,000 Acres, and she was asking me questions about the war that I couldn't answer. And she said, Diane, your research is not complete. I said, Jane, I've been doing research for 12 years. She said, well, nonetheless, there's more to come. So I was going through the manuscript page by page, scene by scene, and I came upon this scene where there was a drought. And I thought, now, Diane, you just made that up out of your pure imagination. You just made it up. And you have no idea. And someone who really knows history is going to say to you, there was no drought then. So I thought, how do I research this? And I began to look up the weather. And I found that you can actually find the weather almost day by day, that far back. And that the Civil War came at the end of the Little Ice Age, during the global warming that occurred at the end of the Little Ice Age. Little Ice Age being from about 1300 to about 1850. And that the weather that occurred then as a result of that climate change were these extremes of weather, extremes of storms, extremes of temperatures, hot and cold, very like what we are encountering today as a matter of climate change. And that this was a major factor in the outcome and the progression of the war. And then I was really just not only surprised, but I was hooked.
Your characters exhibit qualities across the spectrum. How do you go about developing a character?
Well, one thing is my basis as a therapist. I have a strong sense of how personality is developed and how it is acted out, and the backgrounds of people as it affects how they become in their lifetime, and how they react to different circumstances and what they may seek as a result. So I have that sort of foundation. And the second thing is that I put myself into the place of the character so that I can feel what they feel. If I were this person, what would I be feeling in this circumstance? So I like to feel myself in the person of that character. So I sort of switch places. I put myself there and I think, now, would this cloth be itching me? Would my feet hurt? Would a gust of wind with some dust make me cough? Would a shadow across the sky divert my attention? So I really enjoy feeling myself in the scene with the characters.
And what would you say are the major themes, and how do you see their importance?
Well, I have to say, first of all, social justice. I think it's a major theme worldwide at the moment. And one of the ways in which I think we can helpfully approach current issues that are difficult is by looking at history. So I think when you look at those same themes in history, it gives you an empathy and a compassion that perhaps the headlines don't. I think the second um, really universal theme is that of family and community relationships. That's apropos to all of us, regardless of our time in history. And I don't think it changes all that much. Social mores do change, societies do change, but there is something in our human nature that has to do with family, with friendships, with sibling relationships that carries through time. Um, Another of the themes that is really important to me that I think is a thread throughout the entire book is that of our most well-intentioned decisions and actions that result in unintended consequences. And this is something that I run up against. I'm sure that other people do. I hear it all the time. I tried my best. I was trying to do something good, and this great difficulty resulted from it, and it was a mistake. And yet, my intentions were the very best possible. And this book begins with such an intention on the part of Emily. She's trying to have someone rescued, and from there, the whole horrific plot develops.
So you mentioned using history to have empathetic conversations around social justice. Can you give us some tools that people can use to open up these types of conversations with people who are maybe not that naturally inclined towards empathy?
I think that reading and literature are probably one of our very best tools for enhancing empathy and compassion, uh, and understanding of situations that are sometimes foreign to us. Often people, I think travel is another one. People go into areas that they have not experienced before. But in story, in literature, in good writing, people can go into lives that they could not otherwise experience at all. And or they might just um, blow that person off, and I don't want to know you. I don't want to know anything about you. You are not my kind of person. You're a bad person. You are a weak person. But when you experience a character and a story in literature that is not the stereotype, that's not just the good guy or the bad guy or woman, as the case may be, and you begin to see and feel under their skin who they really are, how they feel, what makes them feel that way, what makes them respond the way that they do, then you can begin to experience some of that curiosity and compassion out in life. People become less than a stereotype.
You must have had to immerse yourself in that time period for the writing process. Can you tell me how the characters revealed themselves to you?
Oh, yes. Well, of course, some of them just by putting myself in their place, trying to feel what they would feel, and just suddenly knowing what they would say, or when they would turn their back, or when they would run to embrace someone, or when they would be afraid, things like that. But there is a technique that is common to writing and is taught often, in various writing programs that is a character dialogue, character interview, where you actually have a dialogue with your character. So, and it starts fairly simply, like in fact, you can find whole lists of questions that you would ask a character. And it might start with, well, what is your favorite color? Blue. What's your favorite food? Peanut butter. What's your favorite memory? Wading in the creek. And the questions get more and more complex from there. And I tend to just start with a few simple questions like that, and then just let the characters speak to me. And sometimes one of my characters, Emily's sister-in-law, who was a real puzzle to me. She truly was. I had no idea how she got to be the way she was. I knew how she was, but I didn't know how she got to be that way. And I sat down with the pencil and paper one day and said, all right, Belinda, talk to me. And at first she wouldn't. And then I asked her 2 or 3 fairly simple questions, and suddenly she wouldn't stop talking. And she told me a story of her birth and its aftermath that I could never have simply made up, and how it affected her family relationships all along. And then suddenly who she was made perfect sense to me.
You have a sideline character called Amy who originally was relegated to a small role, yet she wouldn't leave you alone, and now she's going to have her own book. How did that happen?
Well, my first writing teacher was Madeline Lingle, whom you probably know from A Wrinkle in Time. It's a children's classic that's quite famous. And Madeline wrote a book called Walking on Water, Reflections on Faith and Art. And her premise is that the work knows more than you do, and it comes to you from somewhere else to be birthed. And if you say yes, then your job is to serve the work and to follow it where it knows it needs to go. So Amy, as a minor character in a subplot, however, the role she plays in the whole thread of the story is significant and actually major, even though she's not a major character. And I was enchanted with this child, and she wouldn't leave me alone. And I just kept thinking about her, and she kept sort of nudging me and staying in my mind. And I thought, she needs a book. She needs her story told. And so I knew that she needed to survive some major disaster. And I discovered that during her lifetime, when she would have been a young adult, would have been the Charleston earthquake, which I guess I knew about, but not really well. But was and still is not the most disastrous, but the largest earthquake that has ever hit the United States. And from there, she's just taken flight.
So now it's time for Tweet of the Week, where we do a deep dive into your tweets and select one for you to tell us more about. You recently tweeted 1.5 hours of hot yoga with my daughter. Whoa. Then the image said, it's never too late, it's never too bad, and you're never too old or too sick to start from scratch once again. Those sound like words to live by. Can you tell us more about that and the yoga?
I think those are words to live by. I am not really good at yoga. My daughter had been away on a yoga retreat. I assumed she was wonderful. I was staying with her. And she said, let's go to yoga. So I went, and it was a real challenge. And about halfway through it, I thought, oh, I can't do this. And then I thought, yes, I can. Yes, I can, and I will. And there was a woman in this class who's considerably older than I am. I think she was in her 80s. And there was a young man who I assumed to be a professional dancer. I've never seen anyone so lithe and flexible and full of grace. And when we walked out of the class and we're conversing with people, I happened to see that quote on the window into the studio. And I said, I have to have a picture of that. And the teacher said, yes, you wouldn't believe the stories of the people in the class that you've just participated in and come through and done really well. You made it. And it turns out that this young man had been run over, not just hit, but run over with hundreds of bones broken by a hit and run truck, not just a car, a truck. And here he was, and the way that he had recovered was through the yoga. And I've had some challenges myself. I've had a fairly disastrous back surgery that left me with some real incapacities. I've had, I've been in crisis care with both lungs filled with blood clots, which is how my mother died after I was born. It's an inherited condition. And I made it, and they said I'd never be off oxygen 24/7. But I thought, well, athletes and opera singers can increase their lung capacity. If I could do something to increase my lung capacity, that would mean new tissue that was not scarred. And maybe I could get off the oxygen. It took me a year and a half to wean myself from the oxygen in the daytime, but I did it. And here I am talking to you about a book that I am now, it's my debut novel. And here I am. So there really are, I really, that one moment with my daughter in the hot yoga with that saying, it's really never too late to overcome whatever odds you may think are against you. It can be done.
That is so inspiring. Diane's book is available on Amazon, and you can find the link in the description below the video, as well as the link to her website, DianeMcPhailAuthor.com. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Melissa. It's been a delight to be with you. I appreciate it very much.